In the sun-scorched plains of Colonial Virginia, 1753, where the earth cracked under the weight of a relentless summer, the wind carried whispers of freedom and fear. The Shenandoah Valley stretched like a canvas of dreams and despair, its rolling hills scarred by the plow and the blood of those who toiled beneath it. The girls' cries grew fainter, swallowed by the rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a wolf. The Apache raid was a shadow on the valley, their swift hooves and silent blades a threat that kept settlers and slaves alike on edge. Enoch knew the risk of his act saving a white child could earn him praise or a lash, depending on the overseer's mood. The master of Willow Creek, Elias Hawthorne, was a man of cold ambition. His wealth built on the backs of those like Enoch, his heart as hard as the iron he traded. The overseer Caleb Voss was worse, a man whose cruelty was a flame fed by power, his whip a constant threat. Yet Enoch moved forward, Abigail clinging to him, her small hands gripping his tattered shirt. "You're strong," she whispered, her voice a thread of trust that wove itself into Enoch's soul. He said nothing, but his silence was a vow, a promise to protect her, even if it cost him everything. The forest gave way to the plantation's edge, where the tobacco fields stretched under a sky bruised with dusk. Enoch's steps slowed, his eyes scanning for Voss's shadow. The overseer was there, his lean frame silhouetted against the fading light, his whip coiled like a serpent. "Enoch," he barked, his voice sharp as a blade. "What's this?" Abigail tightened her grip, her face buried in Enoch's chest, and he stood tall, his voice steady. "Lost her in the woods, sir." "Lost Apache raid." Voss's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between Enoch and the girl, suspicion a poison in his stare. "You'll answer for this?" "A white child in your hands," he sneered. His heart pounded, not with fear of the overseer's whip, though. It would surely come but with a primal need to protect, to save what he had lost in another life. He found her at the edge of a clearing, crumpled beside a stream, her small body shivering, her pale face streaked with mud and tears. Her hair, the color of wheat, was tangled with thorns, and her blue eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Enoch as he knelt beside her. "Don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. Enoch's hands, scarred and strong, hovered gently, his voice a low murmur, like the river he remembered from home. "I won't, child," he said. "You're safe now." The name, she told him, was Abigail, daughter of a settler family whose wagon had been ambushed by an Apache raiding party on the valley's edge. She had fled, lost and alone, her world shattered by fire and blood. Enoch's heart ached, seeing in her eyes the same fear his own daughter had known before the sea took her. He lifted her gently, her small frame light as a bird, carried her through the forest, his steps sure despite the weight of his chains. Tobacco fields sprawled under a sky that burned gold, their leaves heavy with the sweat of enslaved hands. Among them was Enoch, a man of 30, his skin dark as the riverbed, his eyes deep with the wisdom of a stolen homeland. Born in a village by the Niger River, he had been torn from his people, chained, and shipped across the sea to this land of iron and ash. His hands, broad and calloused, worked the fields, but his heart was a silent drum, beating with memories of a life where he was more than a shadow. Enoch was a man of quiet strength, his voice low, his gaze steady, but beneath his calm lay a fire that no whip could quench. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a cry shattered the stillness, a child's scream, piercing the dusk. Enoch's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the edge of the plantation, where the forest met the fields. There, stumbling through the underbrush, was a girl, no more than 7, her pale face streaked with dirt, her dress torn. She was a settler's child, lost and terrified, her cries drawing the attention of unseen dangers. Enoch's heart stirred, a memory of his own daughter, lost to the sea, flashing through his mind. Without a thought, he dropped his hoe and ran toward her, heedless of the overseer's shout. The forest was a maze of shadows, but Enoch's steps were sure, guided by an instinct older than the chains that bound him. The Shenandoah Valley he found her, trembling, her blue eyes wide with fear, and in that moment the world shifted. The dust of destiny settled around them, and Enoch, a slave in a land of thorns, became a savior unaware that this act would weave a bond stronger than blood, a thread that would unravel secrets and set the stars ablaze. In the sweltering summer of 1753 was a land of stark contrasts, lush green hills cradling the scars of tobacco fields, where the air hung heavy with the musk of earth and the faint bitter temps of servitude. The plantation of Willow Creek sprawled across the valley's heart, its grand house of weathered timber looming over rows of slave cabins, their roofs sagging under the weight of despair. Enoch, his broad frame bent under the sun's unrelenting gaze, was a figure of quiet endurance among the enslaved. His hands, rough as the bark of the oaks that fringed the fields, moved with a rhythm born of survival, planting and harvesting under the overseer's watchful eye. Yet his spirit was a river, deep and unyielding, flowing with memories of a Niger village where he had once been a storyteller, a father, a man free to walk beneath the stars. Now, in this foreign land, he was a shadow, his name stripped to a single syllable, his past a wound that bled in silence. But the cry of the lost girl had stirred something within him, a spark that refused to be doused. Her scream, sharp and desperate, had pierced the dusk, pulling him from the fields into the wild tangle of the forest where danger lurked in every shadow. The forest was a labyrinth of pine and cedar, its floor thick with brambles that clawed at Enoch's legs as he ran. Plantation was a world away, its fields a distant hum, but danger was never far. The plantation house loomed ahead, its windows glowing like eyes in the twilight. Hawthorne emerged, his face a mask of curiosity and disdain, his wife, Margaret, at his side, her eyes softening at the sight of Abigail. But his mind was elsewhere, tethered to Abigail's face, her blue eyes bright with a trust he had not known since his daughter was torn from him on a distant shore. The memory of her loss to the sea was a wound that bled anew. Yet Abigail's voice, "He's my father now," was a balm, fragile but potent. He carried the air of a man who had seen too much, his eyes sharp with secrets. "Elias," he said, his voice rough but familiar, "I've come for the girl." Hawthorne's face paled, a rare crack in his composure, and Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. The stranger's gaze fell on Abigail, then on Enoch, lingering with a curiosity that felt like a blade. "I'm Thomas Reed," he said, his voice softening as he knelt before Abigail. "Your uncle, your true family." The words were a thunderclap, shattering the fragile bond Enoch had felt with the girl. Abigail's eyes widened, confusion clouding her trust, and Enoch's heart sank, a stone in a river of doubt. Reed's presence was an element perturbateur, a thread pulled loose in the tapestry of Enoch's world. He claimed Abigail was his niece, daughter of his sister, lost in the Apache raid. But his eyes held a shadow of something unspoken, a secret that could unravel everything. Hawthorne dismissed Enoch with a curt nod, but as he left the parlor, Abigail's voice followed him, a whisper that cut deeper than any whip. "Father." The word was a spark, a danger, a promise. Outside, the valley was dark, the air heavy with the threat of rain, and Enoch stood alone, his soul a forge where hope and fear were hammered into something new. Voss's shadow loomed in the distance, his whip a silent threat, and Enoch knew the stranger's arrival had changed everything. The girl who called him father was a light in his darkness, but her true bloodline was a storm on the horizon. And Enoch, a slave in a land of thorns, stood at the edge of a reckoning. Voss prowled the fields, his whip cracking against the air, his eyes lingering on Enoch with a malice that promised retribution. "You've stepped above your place, boy," he muttered as he passed, his voice a low growl. "Calling you father won't save you." Enoch said nothing, his silence a shield, but his heart burned with a defiance he could not voice. The slaves around him worked in hushed tension, their glances fleeting but heavy with meaning. Some saw him as a fool, risking the whip for a white child's whim. Others saw a spark, a man who dared to be more than a shadow. Among them was Ruth, an older woman whose hands were gnarled from years of toil, her eyes sharp with the wisdom of survival. "Mind yourself, Enoch," she whispered as they passed in the field. "That girl's love is a chain of its own." Her words were a warning but also a truth, and Enoch felt their weight settle into his bones. "Where did you find her?" "The child," Margaret gasped, rushing forward. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and impending rain. The cicadas hum a chorus to his steps. He entered the house, his head bowed, his heart a quiet storm. parlor was a world apart from the fields, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced settlers, its air heavy with the scent of wax and wealth. Hawthorne sat in a haback chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes cold as river stones. Margaret stood beside him, Abigail clinging to her skirts, her small face pale but fierce. "You saved the girl," Hawthorne said, his voice measured, a blade wrapped in silk. "For that you have my thanks. But her words calling you father are a trouble we cannot abide. I only brought her to safety." Enoch's gaze remained on the floor, his voice low but steady. "Affection is another. You're a slave, Enoch. Know your place." "Yeah, I meant no offense, sir." Margaret's eyes softened, but Hawthorne's did not. "Safety is one thing," he said. "He's my father now." Abigail's voice broke the silence, small but sharp. "He's my father," she insisted, stepping forward, her blue eyes blazing. The room stilled, the air taut with the weight of her words. Margaret gasped, Hawthorne's jaw tightened, and Enoch felt a chill, knowing the girl's innocence was a fire that could burn them both. Enoch released Abigail, her small hand lingering in his, her eyes holding a trust that cut deeper than any lash. Enoch recounted the story, his words careful, his head bowed, but Abigail's voice broke through, small but clear. "He saved me," she said, her blue eyes fierce. The words hung in the air, a spark in a dry field, and Enoch's heart stilled. The slaves around them froze, their whispers a hush of awe and fear. Voss's face twisted, his whip twitching, but Margaret's hand on her husband's arm stayed his wrath. "Take her inside," Hawthorne ordered, his voice cold but pragmatic. "The slave will be dealt with later." As Margaret led her away, Abigail looked back, her voice a whisper that carried across the yard. "Father." The word was a brand, a bond, a danger. Their hands busy, but their whispers carried on the breeze tales of Enoch's courage, of the girl's trust, of a bond that defied the iron laws of their world. Enoch stood alone, Voss's gaze a blade at his back. The plantation, a crucible where his act of courage could forge a new path or burn him to ash. The valley was silent now, the Apache threat, a fading echo. But Enoch felt a storm gathering within him, a fire kindled by a child's trust, a flame that would challenge the chains of his world. The Shenandoah Valley, in the waning summer of 1753, was a tapestry woven with threads of beauty and brutality. The tobacco fields of Willow Creek Plantation stretched beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, green leaves shimmering in the heat, each one a silent testament to the labor of those bound in chains. Enoch stood in the yard, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of Caleb Voss's gaze. The overseer's whip dangling like a coiled snake at his side. The word father, spoken by Abigail in her small, defiant voice, lingered in the air, a spark that threatened to ignite the dry tinder of the plantation's order. Enoch's heart was a drum, its rhythm steady but laced with fear, for he knew the danger of a white child claiming a slave as kin. The other slaves, scattered across the yard, kept their eyes low. The plantation house loomed behind, its timber walls weathered by time, its windows watching like unblinking eyes. Elias Hawthorne, the master, stood on the porch, his face a mask of calculation, while his wife, Margaret, clutched Abigail close, her eyes torn between gratitude and unease. Enoch's act of saving the girl had stirred a storm, and he stood at its center, a man whose chains could not bind the fire in his soul. The day passed in a haze of toil, Enoch's hands moving through the familiar rhythm of planting, his back bent under the sun's unrelenting glare. As dusk fell, painting the valley in shades of violet and ash, Enoch was summoned to the plantation house. Before Hawthorne could speak, a new figure entered the parlor, a stranger, tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and time, his coat dusty from the road. The stranger's shadow, the Shenandoah Valley. In the humid twilight of 1753 was a land where hope and cruelty intertwined like vines strangling an oak. Willow Creek Plantation stood as a monument to both, its tobacco fields stretching beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds, the air thick with the scent of earth and impending rain. She was in the plantation house, under Margaret's care, her small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of a world that saw Enoch as less than human. The air was heavy, the first drops of rain spitting against the earth, and Voss's eyes followed him like a hawk tracking prey. Wanted to speak, to claim the bond Abigail had forged, but he knew the cost of such defiance. Enoch returned to the slave cabins, his body soaked, his soul alight with the girl's trust and the stranger's threat. Willow Creek Plantation stood resolute against the deluge. Its tobacco rose glistening like green veins under a bruised sky, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and unspoken rebellion. Enoch rose from his pallet in the slave cabin, his body aching from the previous day's toil, his heart a forge where the embers of Abigail's trust burned bright against the shadow of Thomas Reed's arrival. The girl's voice father echoed in his soul, a fragile thread weaving hope through the iron chains of his existence. But the plantation was a crucible, and Enoch knew that trust, like hope, it could be a dangerous spark in a world ruled by whip and will. The far fields, where Hawthorne had banished him, where a punishment veiled his labor, a place where the overseer Caleb Voss's cruelty reigned unchecked. Enoch moved through the morning mist, his hands steady as he worked the soil, but his eyes scanned the horizon, searching for a glimpse of Abigail, wondering if her small heart still held him as kin. Ruth was there, her eyes sharp in the dim light of a single candle. "You're playing with fire, Enoch," she said, her voice a mix of warning and pity. "That man Reed, he's no simple uncle. There's a shadow on him and it'll fall on you." Enoch said nothing, but her words were a thread pulled loose, unraveling the fragile hope he had woven with Abigail. Reed's arrival was a disruption, a secret waiting to be unveiled, and Enoch felt its weight like a chain around his heart. The plantation was a crucible, its fields a forge where courage and fear were hammered into something new. Enoch lay on his pallet, the rain a drumbeat against the roof, and saw Abigail's face in his mind, her blue eyes fierce with trust. He thought of his daughter, lost to the sea, and of the Niger village where he had once told stories under the stars. The girl who called him father was a spark in his darkness, but Reed's shadow was a storm that could drown them both. Enoch closed his eyes, his heart a river flowing with memories and dreams, knowing that the path ahead would demand a sacrifice he could not yet fathom. Slaves did not claim white children, not in this land of iron and blood. Yet Abigail's trust was a flame he could not extinguish, a light in the darkness of his chains. "She's a child," Enoch said at last, his voice low but steady, his eyes on Hawthorne. "She speaks from fear, from gratitude, meant only to protect her." Reed's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing, his silence a weight heavier than words. Hawthorne leaned back, his fingers drumming on the desk. "You'll work the far fields tomorrow," he said, a punishment veiled as a command. "And you'll stay away from the girl, understood?" Enoch nodded, his head bowed, but his heart burned with a defiance he could not voice. As he turned to leave, Abigail's voice followed him, a whisper that cut through the storm. "Don't go, father." The word was a blade, and Enoch felt it pierce him, a wound that bled hope and pain. He stepped into the rain, the cold drops a baptism of resolve, and Voss's shadow loomed nearby, his whip a silent promise of retribution. The parlor was a world of wealth and power, its walls lined with books Enoch could not read, its air thick with the scent of polished wood and candle wax. Hawthorne sat at his desk, his face a mask of authority, while Margaret stood by the hearth, her hands clasped, her eyes flickering with unease. Abigail was there, perched on a chair, her small hands folded, her gaze fixed on Enoch with a trust that made his heart ache. Reed stood by the window, his lean frame silhouetted against the storm, his eyes sharp as flint. "Ah, Enoch," Hawthorne said, his voice smooth but edged with warning. "You've done a service by saving the girl, but her uncle claims her now. You'll keep your distance." Reed stepped forward, his gaze raking over Enoch, a mix of curiosity and disdain. "My sister's child doesn't belong in a slave's arms," he said, his voice rough but measured. "She's a Reed, and I'll take her to her rightful home." Abigail's face crumpled, her small voice rising in protest. "He saved me," she said, her eyes blazing. "He's my father." The word was a thunderclap, and Enoch felt the room shift, the air taut with tension. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, Hawthorne's eyes narrowed, and Reed's lips twitched. A flicker of something anger, perhaps, or fear that Enoch could not name. He had seen her through a window as he passed, her wheat-colored hair catching the light, her blue eyes searching the yard as if looking for him. The memory of her trust was a fire in his chest. But Reed's words, "your true family," were a cold wind threatening to extinguish it. Enoch knew the danger of hope, the way it could burn brighter than any lash yet, leave scars just as deep. Ruth, the older slave woman, worked beside him, her gnarled hands deft despite her years. "You've stirred a hornet's nest, Enoch," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustle of tobacco leaves. "That girl's kin will bring trouble. Blood calls to blood, and it ain't yours." Enoch's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence a shield against the truth in her words. He was a slave, his life bound by chains, his heart tethered to a child who could never truly be his. Yet Abigail's voice, small and fierce, echoed in his soul, a defiance of the world that sought to break them both. Enoch moved through the fields, his hands steady despite the weight of the day's events, his heart a quiet furnace burning with the memory of Abigail's voice. "Father." The word was a spark that warmed and wounded, a bond forged in a moment of courage now threatened by the stranger's arrival. Thomas Reed, the man who called himself Abigail's uncle, had cast a shadow over the plantation, his dusty coat and sharp eyes carrying secrets that unsettled the fragile order of Enoch's world. The slaves whispered of him as they worked, their voices low, their glances fleeting. Some said he was a wanderer, others a spy, but all agreed his presence was a storm waiting to break. Enoch felt it too, a prickle of unease that ran deeper than Voss's whip or Hawthorne's cold commands. The girl who had clung to him in the forest, who had named him father, was now a thread pulled taut, and Enoch feared what would happen when it snapped. The day's labor was relentless, the sun, a hammer beating down on the fields, but Enoch's thoughts were with Abigail. As dusk settled, painting the valley in shades of indigo and ash, Enoch was called to the plantation house once more. The storm broke outside, rain lashing the windows, and Enoch stood still, his heart a battlefield of hope and dread. The night was a tumult of wind and water, the valley alive with the storm's fury. The Shenandoah Valley, in the stormy dawn of 1753, was a land where the earth itself seemed to weep, its fields sodden with rain, its skies heavy with the weight of secrets. The far fields were a world apart, isolated from the main plantation, where the tobacco grew sparse and the earth was stubborn, yielding only to relentless effort. Voss prowled like a wolf, his whip a constant threat, his pale eyes glinting with a malice that fed on Enoch's defiance. "You thought saving that girl would make you something more?" Hugh sneered, his voice cutting through the rain's soft patter. Their gazes met, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them, her trust. His resolve, a bond that defied the chains of their world. The rain had returned, a soft drizzle that cloaked the valley in mist, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and fear. "You're the one who saved her," Reed said, his voice low, his eyes searching Enoch's face. "Abigail speaks of you as if you're kin. Why?" Enoch's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady, his head bowed. "I found her in the woods, sir. She was scared. I brought her to safety." Reed's lips twitched, a flicker of something doubt, perhaps, or calculation. "She's my niece," he said, but the words lacked conviction, as if he were reciting a script. "Her mother was my sister, killed in the raid. But you're a slave. What do you gain from her trust?" Enoch's hands clenched, the question a blade that cut deep. "Nothing, sir," he said. "Only to see her safe." Reed's gaze lingered, his silence a weight heavier than words. And Enoch felt the stranger's shadow grow darker, a storm gathering on the horizon. As Reed turned away, Abigail appeared, slipping from the house, her small form darting through the rain to reach Enoch. "Father," she whispered, her voice a spark in the dark, her small hand finding his. The word was aflame, and Enoch's heart burned with it, but Reed's eyes were on them, sharp and unyielding. The plantation was a powder keg, the Apache threat, a spark. And Enoch stood at the heart of it, his bond with Abigail a fire that could light the way or burn them all to ash. The valley held its breath, and Enoch, a slave in a land of thorns, felt the weight of a destiny he could not yet grasp. But Reed was there too, his lean frame a shadow at her side, his hand resting on her shoulder with a possessiveness that chilled Enoch's blood. The messenger's news brought chaos to the plantation, with Hawthorne barking orders, Voss rallying the overseers, and Margaret clutching Abigail close. Enoch was assigned to fortify the stockade, his hands hauling logs alongside other slaves, their labor a frantic defense against the looming threat. But his eyes kept drifting to Reed, who moved with a purpose that seemed out of place. His sharp gaze scanning the horizon as if expecting something more than Apache raiders. Ruth's warning echoed in Enoch's mind. He no settler and. He felt a prickle of unease, sensed that Reed's secrets were a thread that could unravel everything. You're nothing, Enoch. Less than nothing. The words were a lash, but Enoch's silence was a shield, his heart armored by the memory of Abigail's trust. He thought of her in the plantation house, under Margaret's care, her blue eyes fierce with a loyalty that defied the world's rules. But Reed's presence loomed larger now, a shadow that darkened the edges of Enoch's hope. The stranger's claim your true family was a blade that cut deeper than Voss's whip, threatening to sever the bond Enoch had forged with the girl. The other slaves in the far fields worked in hushed tension, their glances fleeting but heavy with meaning. Ruth, her hands gnarled as roots, caught Enoch's eye as she passed, her voice low. "That man Reed's got secrets," she whispered. "He's no settler. Watch him, Enoch. He'll break more than your heart." Her warning was a thread pulled loose, and Enoch felt its weight, a premonition of a storm he could not yet see. Midday brought a break in the rain, the sky clearing to reveal a sun that burned with a cold, indifferent light. Enoch's hands moved through the soil, planting seeds that would feed Hawthorne's wealth, but his mind was with Abigail. He had not seen her since the parlor, since her small voice had defied Hawthorne in red, claiming him as father, warming and wounding. A reminder of the daughter he had lost to the sea, her face fading with each passing year. Abigail was not his blood, but her trust was a bond stronger than chains, a light in the darkness of his servitude. As the day wore on, a commotion stirred at the edge of the fields a rider, his horse lathered with sweat, galloping toward the plantation house. Enoch's heart quickened, sensing a shift in the air, a ripple in the valley's uneasy calm. The rider was a messenger, his voice carrying across the fields as he shouted for Hawthorne. Apache sighted, he called. "They're moving east, toward the valley." The words were a spark, igniting fear among the slaves and overseers alike. The Apache raids, though rare, were a specter that haunted the Shenandoah, their swift blades a threat to settler and slave alike. Voss cursed, his whip snapping against the air, and Enoch's thoughts raced to Abigail, safe for now in the house, but vulnerable if the raiders came closer. As the slaves were herded back to the main plantation, Enoch caught a glimpse of Abigail through the house's window, her small figure standing on the porch, her eyes searching the yard. That night, as the plantation braced for a possible raid, Enoch was summoned to the stockade's edge, where Reed waited, his face half-lit by a flickering torch. The Shenandoah Valley, in the rain-soaked twilight of 1753, was a land where shadows danced with menace, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and the sharp temps of fear. Willow Creek Plantation stood as a fortress against the gathering storm, its stockade reinforced with logs in desperation, its tobacco fields silent under a sky that wept without mercy. Enoch stood watch at the stockade's edge, his broad frame silhouetted against the flickering torchlight, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats both seen and unseen. Enoch's heart quickened as he saw Abigail slip from the door, her small figure darting through the rain, her wheat-colored hair plastered to her face. She ran to him, heedless of Voss's glare, her blue eyes fierce with a determination that belied her age. A scout rode into the plantation, his horse lathered, his voice hoarse with urgency. Willow Creek Plantation stood tense, its stockade a fragile bulwark against the specter of Apache raiders, its tobacco fields silent under a sky heavy with mist and menace. Caleb Voss prowled the stockade, his whip a constant threat, his pale eyes glinting with a cruelty that fed on the chaos. "Work faster, Enoch," he snarled, his voice a lash that cut through the mist. "Your little daughter won't save you if the savages breach the walls." The word daughter was a sneer, a reminder of Enoch's place, but he kept his head bowed, his silence a shield against the overseer's malice. His thoughts were with Abigail, safe for now in the plantation house, but vulnerable to Reed's influence, to the secrets that hung around him like smoke. Ruth's warning, "He's no uncle," echoed in his mind, and Enoch's suspicion grew, fueled by the glimpse of papers she had mentioned. Letters with strange seals that hinted at a truth buried deep. Worked through the day, his hands steady but his heart racing. Each log he placed a step toward protecting Abigail, toward uncovering the shadow that Red cast. Enoch worked among the slaves, his broad hands hauling logs to reinforce the defenses. His heart a furnace where Abigail's trust burned against the shadow of Thomas Reed's secrets. The girl's voice, father, was a flame that warmed his soul, but it was also a spark in a world primed to ignite. Where a slave's bond with a white child was a rebellion against the iron laws of the land. Reed's presence was a storm cloud over the plantation, his sharp eyes and guarded words a thread that threatened to unravel the fragile hope Enoch had woven with Abigail. The slaves whispered of him, their voices hushed with fear and suspicion. Reed was no uncle, no settler, but a man whose secrets were a blade poised to cut through their world. Enoch felt it too, a prickle of unease that grew with each glance Red cast his way. Each moment Abigail's trust clashed with the stranger's claim. "The Apache are closer," he shouted, his words sending a ripple of fear through the stockade. "They've hit a settlement to the east. We need every man." Hawthorne emerged, his face grim, and ordered the slaves to reinforce the defenses, their labor a desperate shield against the raiders. Enoch worked alongside the others, his hands steady, but his mind racing. He caught glimpses of Abigail through the day, her small figure hovering at the house's edge, her eyes searching for him. Reed was never far, his presence a constant shadow, his sharp gaze tracking Enoch's every move. Ruth, working nearby, leaned close as they hauled logs, her voice a whisper. "That man's hiding something," she said. "I saw him with papers, letters, with strange seals." "No, Uncle Enoch. Watch him close." Her words were a spark, igniting Enoch's suspicion, and he resolved to learn the truth, to protect the girl who had claimed him as kin. The plantation was a powder keg, the Apache raid a match, and Reed's secrets a fire waiting to burn. Enoch's heart was a river, flowing with memories of his lost daughter, with Abigail's trust, with a defiance that grew stronger with each passing hour. As the valley braced for the raiders, Enoch stood at the stockade. His soul a forge where courage was shaped, knowing that the bond with Abigail was a flame that could light the way or consume them all. "Father," she whispered, her voice a spark in the dark, her small hand finding his. "I don't want to go with him. He's not my family. You are." The words were a fire, burning through Enoch's fear, but they were also a danger, a defiance that could cost them both. Before he could speak, Reed's voice cut through the rain, sharp and commanding. "Abigail." The stranger strode toward them, his coat drenched, his eyes narrowing as he saw Enoch. "Get away from him, girl. It's no kin of yours." Abigail clung tighter to Enoch, her small body trembling, and Enoch's heart ached with a love he could not name. "She's scared, sir," he said, his voice low but steady, his head bowed to hide the fire in his eyes. "She needs comfort, nothing more." Reed's lips twitched, a flicker of anger or doubt, but he grabbed Abigail's arm, pulling her gently but firmly away. "You're a Reed," he said, his voice softening for her, but hard for Enoch. "Your blood belongs with me." Abigail's eyes met Enoch's, a silent plea, and he felt the world tilt, the bond between them stretched to breaking. Voss, the overseer, prowled nearby, his whip coiled but ever present, his pale eyes glinting with a cruelty that thrived in the chaos. Reed's claim was a lie, or half a truth. He felt it in his bones, in the way the stranger's eyes avoided his, in the way his words lacked the weight of family. But to challenge him was to invite Voss's whip, Hawthorne's wrath, the plantation's iron laws. Enoch stood still, his hands clenched, as Reed led Abigail back to the house, her small figure disappearing into the shadows. Voss's laughter was a cruel echo, his whip snapping against the stockade's wood. "You're dreaming, Enoch," he sneered. "A slave with a white daughter. You'll hang for that dream." The words were a blade, but Enoch's resolve was a forge, hammering fear into courage. He returned to his post. The rain, a baptism of purpose, his heart tethered to the girl who called him father. The Apache threat loomed, but it was Reed's shadow that haunted him. A secret waiting to unravel, a truth that could set them free or bind them tighter in chains. "Keep your eyes sharp, Enoch," he growled, his voice laced with disdain. "Your little daughter won't save you if the savages come." The word daughter was a sneer, a lash that cut deeper than leather, but Enoch's silence was a shield, his heart armored by the memory of Abigail's hand in his. He thought of her in the plantation house, safe for now under Margaret's care, but vulnerable to Reed's influence, to the secrets that hung around him like smoke. Ruth's warning echoed in his mind. He is no settler, and Enoch felt the weight of a truth he could not yet grasp. A storm brewing in the stranger's shadowed gaze. Enoch worked among the slaves, his hands raw from hauling timber, his heart a forge where Abigail's trust burned bright against the looming threat of the Apache raid. Her small-voiced father was a flame that warmed his soul. But it was also a spark in a world ready to ignite, where a slave's bond with a white child could bring salvation or ruin. Thomas Reed's shadow clung to the plantation like a curse, his sharp eyes and guarded words a thread that unraveled the fragile order of Enoch's life. The other slaves whispered of him, their voices low, their fear palpable. Red was no mere settler, no simple uncle, but a man whose secrets were a blade held to the throat of their hope. Enoch felt it too, a prickle of unease that grew with each glance Red cast his way. Each moment Abigail's trust clashed with the stranger's claim. The night was a restless beast, the rain a relentless drum against the stockade, the distant howls of wolves mingling with the imagined hoofbeats of Apache raiders. As the night deepened, a commotion stirred at the plantation house. The rain fell harder, a curtain that hid the valley's secrets, but Enoch's mind was a storm of its own. As dawn broke, gray and heavy with mist, a new threat emerged. The Shenandoah Valley, in the fraught dawn of 1753, was a crucible where fear and defiance forged uneasy alliances. The morning was a blur of labor, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and sweat, the plantation alive with the clatter of hammers and the shouts of overseers. As noon approached, the plantation buzzed with tension, the Apache threat, a specter that loomed closer with each passing hour. Enoch caught sight of Abigail at the edge of the stockade, her small figure slipping from the house, her weak-colored hair catching the weak sunlight. She ran to him, heedless of Wass's glare, her blue eyes fierce with a loyalty that defied the world's rules. The air was thick with the crack of muskets, the screams of the wounded, and the eerie war cries of the raiders. Enoch fought alongside the slaves, his hands wielding an axe to repair breaches in the wall, his heart tethered to Abigail, who was hidden in the house under Margaret's care. Enoch stood his ground, his heart a forge where fear was hammered into courage, his hands steady despite the weight of his chains. "I have every right," he said, his voice a quiet river, deep and unyielding. "She calls me father. I saved her life. You speak of blood, but your words are empty. Who are you, Red?" The question was a blade, and Reed flinched, his hand tightening on the knife. The letter in his grasp was a crumpled thing, its seal broken, its contents a secret that Enoch knew held the key to Abigail's fate. Before Reed could answer, a sound broke the tension. Abigail's voice, small but fierce, from the doorway. "Father," she ran to Enoch, her weak-colored hair loose, her blue eyes blazing with a loyalty that defied the world's rules. Margaret followed, her face pale, her hands wringing with distress. "Abigail, come back!" she called, but the girl clung to Enoch, her small arms wrapping around his waist. Reed's face twisted, a mix of anger and desperation, and Enoch felt the room shift. The truth a thread pulled loose, unraveling the lies that bound them. But Reed was there too, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos, his movements to calm for a man under siege. Enoch watched him, his suspicion a fire that burned through the fear. As the raiders were driven back, their attack a fleeting but bloody shadow, Enoch saw Reed slip into the house, a leather satchel clutched in his hand. Heart pounding, Enoch followed, his steps silent, his soul a forge where courage was shaped. He found Reed in the parlor, rifling through papers, a letter with a broken seal in his hand. Their eyes met, and Reed's face paled, his hand reaching for a knife at his belt. "You're meddling in things you don't understand, slave," he hissed. But Enoch stood tall, his voice steady. "I understand enough. You're no uncle. What do you want with her?" The question was a spark, and Reed's silence was a storm, his secrets a blade that could cut them all. The plantation was a battlefield, the Apache raid a fleeting threat compared to the truth that loomed between them. Enoch's heart was a river, flowing with Abigail's trust. With the memory of his lost daughter, with a defiance that would not break. The night was alive with danger, and Enoch, a slave in a land of thorns, stood at the edge of a revelation that could change everything. "Father," she whispered, her voice a spark in the gray dawn, her small hand finding his. Willow Creek Plantation stood battered but unbroken, its stockade scarred from the Apache raid, its tobacco fields silent under a sky streaked with the last embers of dusk. Enoch stood in the parlor of the plantation house, his broad frame tense, his dark eyes locked on Thomas Reed, whose hand hovered over a knife, a letter with a broken seal clutched in his other fist. The room was a crucible, its walls heavy with the weight of secrets, its air charged with the unspoken truth that hung between them. Abigail's voice, father, echoed in Enoch's heart, a flame that burned against the storm of Reed's lies. The Apache raid had been repelled, but the real battle was here, in the flickering candlelight, where a slave dared to challenge a man who claimed a child not his own. The plantation was a powder keg, and Enoch's question, "What do you want with her?" was a spark that threatened to ignite it all. Reed's face was a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, a crack in the facade of his story. "He says I have to go with him, to a place far away, but I want to stay with you." The words were a fire burning through Enoch's fear, but they were also a danger, a defiance that could cost them both. Before he could respond, Reed's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Abigail." The stranger strode toward them, his coat dusty, his eyes narrowing as he saw Enoch. "You're filling her head with nonsense," he said, his voice low but edged with menace. "She's my blood, not yours." Abigail clung tighter to Enoch, her small body trembling, and Enoch's heart ached with a love he could not name. "She's a child, sir," he said, his voice steady, despite the storm within. "She's scared. I mean her no harm." Reed's gaze was a blade, but Abigail's voice broke through, small but fierce. "He saved me," she said. "He's my father." The word was a thunderclap, and Enoch felt the air shift, the plantation's fragile order teetering on the edge of chaos. Voss was upon them in an instant, his whip uncoiling like a serpent, his face twisted with rage. "You dare let her speak such filth," he roared, raising the whip. Enoch braced himself, but the blow never fell. A cry rang out from the stockade's edge. A scout, his horse lathered. Shouting of Apache raiders sighted less than a mile away. The plantation erupted in chaos, Hawthorne barking orders, slaves and overseers scrambling to fortify the walls. Enoch seized the moment, pulling Abigail behind a stack of logs, his hand gentle but firm. "Stay low, child," he whispered, his eyes scanning for Reed. The stranger had vanished in the commotion, but Enoch's suspicion burned brighter, Ruth's words a spark that ignited his resolve. Needed to know the truth about Reed to protect the girl who called him father. As the slaves were herded to their posts, Enoch slipped toward the plantation house, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and purpose. He found Ruth near the stables, her eyes sharp with urgency. "I saw him," she whispered. "Red, with those papers, talking to a man in a dark cloak. They spoke of a debt, of a girl not his own. He's no kin, Enoch. He's a liar." The words were a blade, cutting through the fog of doubt, and Enoch's resolve hardened. Reed's claim was a lie, a thread he would unravel to keep Abigail safe. The Apache raid came at dusk, a swift and silent storm that struck the stockade's eastern flank. The Shenandoah Valley, in the fading light of 1753, was a land where shadows clung like damp cloth. The air thick with the acrid temps of gunpowder and the lingering scent of rain-soaked earth. "You're a slave," Red hissed, his voice low, his knife glinting in the dim light. "You have no right to question me." The parlor door swung open, and Elias Hawthorne entered, his face a mask of fury. Caleb Voss at his side, his whip coiled like a serpent ready to strike. "What is this?" Hawthorne demanded, his eyes sweeping from Enoch to Reed to Abigail, who still clung to the slave she called father. "Enoch, you were told to keep your distance." Voss's whip twitched, his pale eyes glinting with a hunger for violence, but Enoch stood tall, his voice steady. Enoch sat in the slave cabin, his body confined, but his soul a river flowing with purpose. Ruth was there, her eyes sharp in the dim light of a candle. "You've stirred a storm, Enoch," she said, her voice low but urgent. "That letter's no will. I heard Reed talking to a man last night, speaking of debts and a girl to be sold. Abigail's no kin to him, she's a prize." The words were a blade, cutting through the last of Enoch's doubt, and his resolve hardened. Reed was a fraud, a predator, cloaked in family, and Abigail was in danger. The plantation was a crucible, its walls closing in, and Enoch knew he could not stay silent. He thought of his daughter, lost to the sea, her face fading, but her memory a spark that fueled his courage. Abigail's trust was a fire, and he would not let it die. As the night deepened, he slipped from the cabin, his steps silent, his heart a forge where fear was hammered into action. He moved toward the house where Reed slept, where the letter held the truth that could free Abigail or condemn them both. The valley was a shadow, the stars hidden, but Enoch's soul was aflame, burning with the love of a father, the defiance of a man who would not kneel. The truth was a blade, and Enoch, a slave in a land of thorns, was ready to wield it. "I came to protect her, sir," he said, his gaze flicking to Reed. "This man's no uncle, he's hiding something." Reed's lips curled, but his eyes darted to the letter, a telltale sign that Enoch's words had struck true. Hawthorne's gaze narrowed, his voice cold as iron. "Speak, Reed. What's this about?" Reed straightened his composure, a fragile mask, and held up the letter. "This is proof," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "My sister's will, naming me guardian of her child. Abigail is mine by blood." But his words faltered under Enoch's gaze, and Abigail's voice cut through, sharp and clear. "He's lying," she cried. "He doesn't know me. He doesn't love me." The room stilled, the air taut with the weight of her words. And Enoch felt a surge of pride and fear, knowing her defiance could cost them both. Hawthorne snatched the letter from Reed's hand, his eyes scanning the crumpled page, the broken seal a symbol of doubt. "This seal," he said, his voice low, "it's not a settler's mark. It's from the coast, a trader's sigil." Reed's face paled, and Enoch's heart quickened. Ruth's warning letters with strange seals echoing in his mind. The truth was close, a thread ready to snap, but Voss's whip cracked against the floor, a warning that silenced the room. "Enough," the overseer roared. "This slave's caused trouble enough. He'll answer for it." He raised the whip, but Abigail threw herself in front of Enoch, her small body a shield, her voice a thunderclap. "Don't touch him." The act was a spark, igniting the room, and Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Hawthorne's eyes darkened, but he held up a hand, staying Voss's wrath. "Step back, Caleb," he said, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. "We'll settle this properly." He turned to Reed, his gaze piercing. "You'll stay until I verify this letter, Enoch. You're confined to the cabins until I say otherwise." Enoch nodded, his head bowed, but his heart burned with a defiance that would not break. As he was led away, Abigail's eyes followed him, her small hand reaching out, a silent vow that tethered them across the chasm of their world. The night was a restless beast, the plantation alive with whispers of the raid, of Reed's lies, of Abigail's defiance. The Shenandoah Valley, in the restless night of 1753, was a land where shadows wove secrets into the very air. The plantation of Willow Creek, a crucible where hope and cruelty clashed like flint against steel. The rain had ceased, leaving the earth slick and the sky a tapestry of stars veiled by thinning clouds. Enoch moved through the darkness, his broad frame a silent shadow slipping past the slave cabins, his heart a furnace where Abigail's trust burned against the weight of Thomas Reed's lies. "Father?" She ran to Enoch, her wheat-colored hair loose, her blue eyes blazing with a loyalty that shook the room. Reed lunged, his knife aimed at Enoch, but Abigail's cry stopped him, her small body a shield between them. Voss's whip remained coiled, his rage a silent storm, but Hawthorne's word was law, and Enoch was spared. For now, Abigail clung to him, her small arms a bond stronger than blood, and Margaret's eyes held a gratitude that softened the edges of her fear. But Enoch knew the plantation was a fragile piece, its order shaken by a slave who dared to be a father, by a child who defied the world's rules. As he led Abigail back to the house, her hand in his, he felt the weight of their bond, a fire that burned brighter than any whip could quench. The valley was silent now, the Apache threat a fading echo, but Voss's shadow lingered, his malice a promise of retribution. Enoch's heart was a river, flowing with the memory of his lost daughter, with Abigail's trust, with a defiance that would not break. The truth had been a blade, and Enoch had wielded it, but the cost was yet to be paid, and he stood at the edge of a new dawn, a slave in a land of thorns bound to a child, called him father. "Don't hurt him," she screamed, her voice a thunderclap in the quiet parlor. The commotion drew Margaret, her face pale with fear, and Hawthorne, his eyes dark with rage, stormed in, Voss at his side, his whip uncoiling like a serpent. "What is this madness?" Hawthorne roared, his gaze sweeping from Enoch to Reed to Abigail, who clung to the slave she called father. Enoch's heart raced, but he held up the letter, its seal glinting in the candlelight. "This man's no uncle," he said, his voice a river, deep and unyielding. "This letter proves it. He's a traitor, a debtor, planning to sell the girl for coin."
Oh.
Reed's face paled, his knife wavering, and Hawthorne snatched the letter, his eyes scanning the words, his jaw tightening with each line. The seal, a trader's mark from the coast, was no will but a contract. A deal to trade Abigail for a debt owed to a merchant in Williamsburg? Lies, Reed stammered, but his voice cracked, his facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. The girl's voice, father, was a flame that lit his soul. A bond forged in the forest, now threatened by a man whose secrets were a blade poised to sever it. "You dare bring deceit into my house?" he bellowed, turning on Reed. "You're no kin to this child." Margaret gasped, her hands flying to Abigail, who still clung to Enoch, her small body trembling, but her eyes fierce. Voss's whip twitched, his pale eyes glinting with a hunger for violence. But Hawthorne's hand stayed him. "Not yet," he said, his voice cold. "Enoch, speak." Enoch's heart was a forge, hammering fear into courage, and he stepped forward, Abigail's hand in his. "I saved her from the woods," he said, his voice steady. "She calls me father because she trusts me. I ask only to keep her safe." The words were aflame, and Abigail's voice joined his, small but unyielding. "He's my father," she said, her eyes locked on Hawthorne, not him. The room stilled, the air taut with the weight of her defiance. And Enoch felt a surge of pride and fear, knowing her words could be their salvation or their ruin. Hawthorne's gaze softened, a rare crack in his iron facade, and he turned to Margaret, who nodded, tears in her eyes. "The girl stays," Hawthorne said at last, his voice heavy. "Reed, you're done here. Leave, or face the law." Reed's face twisted, but he saw the truth in Hawthorne's eyes. And he fled into the night, his knife clattering to the floor, his secrets a shadow that dissolved in the dark. Ruth's revelation, Abigail, no kin to him she as a prize, was a spark that had ignited Enoch's resolve, driving him toward the plantation house where Reed slept, where a letter with a broken seal held the truth that could free or damn them both. Oh, the stockade loomed silent, its scars from the Apache raid a testament to the valley's fragility. But the real danger was within, in the parlor where power and deceit held court. Enoch's steps were sure, his bare feet silent on the damp earth, his heart a river flowing with the memory of his lost daughter. With Abigail's fierce loyalty, with a defiance that no chain could bind, the plantation house stood like a sentinel, its windows dark save for a single candle's glow in the parlor. Enoch crept to the side, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning for Voss's shadow or the glint of a musket. The overseer's cruelty was a constant threat, but tonight Enoch's purpose was sharper than any whip. He slipped through a servant's door, the air inside heavy with the scent of wax and polished wood. A world of wealth that mocked his chains. The parlor was quiet, the candle casting flickering shadows across the walls, where portraits of stern-faced settlers stared down in judgment. Reed was there, slumped in a chair, the letter with the broken seal open before him, its contents a map of treachery. Enoch's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his hand reaching for the paper, but Reed stirred, his sharp eyes snapping open, his knife flashing in the dim light. "You," he hissed, rising, his voice a venomous whisper. "You think you can steal her from me?" Enoch stood tall, his voice steady, despite the blade's threat. "She's no prize to be stolen," he said. "She's a child, and you're no kin." "What's in that letter, Reed?" The question was a spark, and Reed's face twisted, a mix of fear and fury, his hand tightening on the knife. Before Reed could strike, a sound broke the silence. Abigail's voice, small but fierce, from the doorway. Hawthorne's fury was a storm, his voice a blade that cut through the parlor. The parlor was a crucible, its air charged with the aftermath of truth. The Shenandoah Valley, in the tender dawn of 1753, was a land where the scars of the night revelations lay hidden beneath a veil of mist, the air soft with the scent of wet earth and the promise of renewal. Ruth, her gnarled hands steady as she sorted tobacco leaves, caught Enoch's eye, her voice low but warm. The air was crisp, the earth still damp from the night's rain, and his steps were heavy with the weight of what might come. The parlor was a world of wealth and power, its walls lined with portraits that judged him, its air thick with the scent of wax and authority. Abigail grew under Margaret's care, her bond with Enoch a quiet flame that burned through the years. She never called him anything but father, and though the plantation's rules kept them apart, her visits to the fields, her small gifts of woven cloth or carved wood, were a testament to a love that no chain could break. Enoch worked on, his hands steady, his heart a river flowing with the memory of his lost daughter. With Abigail's trust, with a defiance that grew into a legacy, the slaves spoke of him in whispers, a man who had saved a child and challenged a lie. A spark that lit the way for those who dreamed of freedom. Voss's whip found others to punish, his malice blunted by time. And Hawthorne's pragmatism kept Enoch safe, a grudging respect born of the truth he had uncovered. Abigail, when she came of age, left the plantation, her heart heavy, but her spirit fierce, carrying Enoch's love into a world that was slowly changing. She never forgot him, and years later when the valley heard tales of a woman who fought for the freedom of others. Her name was Abigail, and her story was woven with the courage of a slave who had been her father. Hawthorne sat at his desk, his face a mask of pragmatism, while Margaret stood by the hearth, her eyes soft with gratitude. The plantation was a fading shadow, its power crumbling as the world beyond the valley stirred with whispers of abolition. Enoch's legacy was not in the tobacco he harvested, but in the girl who called him father. In the spark of defiance that lived in her and the stories told by those who remembered a slave who dared to love. The Shenandoah Valley stood witness, its hills a testament to a fire that burned through chains, a light that shone in the darkness of a land of thorns. Enoch's heart was a river, flowing with the memory of his lost daughter, with Abigail's trust, with a love that had remade the world in its quiet, unyielding way. Abigail was there, her wheat-colored hair tied back, her blue eyes bright with a love that defied the chains of their world. "Enoch," Hawthorne said, his voice measured, a blade wrapped in silk. "You've stirred a storm, but you've also done a service. The girl stays, and Reed is gone. But you're still a slave, and this changes nothing." The words were a lash, but Enoch's heart was a forge, hammering fear into resolve. "I ask only to keep her safe, sir," he said, his voice steady, his head bowed to hide the fire in his eyes. Abigail stepped forward, her small hand reaching for his, and Margaret's eyes filled with tears, her voice soft. "She loves you," she said, "and I see why. You're a good man, Enoch." The words were a balm, but Hawthorne's gaze was cold, a reminder of the line that could not be crossed. "You've done a mighty thing, Enoch," she said, a rare smile softening her weathered face. "This slave's caused enough trouble," he growled, but Hawthorne raised a hand, his voice firm. "Enough, Caleb. He's earned his place for now." The overseer's lips curled, but he said nothing, his silence a storm waiting to break. Abigail clung to Enoch, her small voice a spark in the quiet room. "You're my father," she said, her eyes fierce. And Enoch's heart swelled, a river overflowing with a love he could not name. He knelt before her, his hands gentle, his voice a low murmur. "I'll always protect you, child," he said, and the words were a vow, a thread that bound them across the chasm of their world. Hawthorne dismissed him, but Margaret's eyes followed, a silent promise of kindness. And Enoch stepped into the morning, his soul alight with a fire that no whip could quench. The plantation was a crucible, its order shaken by a slave who dared to be a father, by a child who defied the laws of blood and bondage. "That girl's yours, blood or no. But watch Voss. He ain't done with you." Her words were a warning, but also a blessing, and Enoch nodded, his heart swelling with a pride he could not voice. He thought of his daughter, lost to the sea, her face a fading memory, and of Abigail, whose trust had rekindled a fire he thought extinguished. The plantation house loomed in the distance, its windows glowing with the soft light of morning, and Enoch knew Abigail was there. Under Margaret's care, her small heart tethered to him despite the world's rules. Hawthorne's decision to keep her, to cast Reed out, was a fragile victory. one that could crumble under the weight of Voss's cruelty or the valley's unforgiving laws. Willow Creek Plantation stood quiet, its stockade a silent witness to the Apache raid's fading echo, its tobacco fields glistening under a sky kissed by the first light of morning. Enoch stood outside the slave cabins, his broad frame silhouetted against the dawn, his heart a river flowing with the weight of Abigail's trust, a flame that had burned through the shadow of Thomas Reed's lies. The girl's voice, father, was a beacon in his soul, a bond forged in the forest and tempered in the crucible of truth. The parlor's confrontation had shifted the plantation's fragile order. Reed's exposure as a fraud, a spark that had lit a new path, but Enoch knew the fire of their bond would demand a price. Caleb Voss's malice lingered like a storm cloud, his whip a silent threat, and Elias Hawthorne's mercy was a thin thread, easily snapped. Yet Abigail's hand in his, her blue eyes fierce with loyalty, was a light that no chain could dim, a legacy that Enoch, a slave in a land of thorns, would carry to his last breath. The morning was a hush of activity, the slaves moving through their tasks with a quiet wariness, their whispers carrying tales of Enoch's courage, of Abigail's defiance, of Reed's flight into the night. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold, Enoch was summoned to the plantation house. Voss entered, his whip coiled, his pale eyes glinting with a malice that promised retribution. Years passed, and the Shenandoah Valley changed, its fields yielding to time, its people to the tides of history. Enoch grew old in the fields, his body worn but his soul unbowed, his heart a forge where courage and love were shaped.